Jeff, I'm excited to talk to you about a couple of movies today. This will be a bit of a double feature here on Kicking the Seat. You're a friend, a fellow critic, and also a fellow artist. And I could think of very few people that I would want to talk more with about these two related but very distinct, very different pieces of work. One is called "Make Me Famous." It's a documentary, and a new documentary, and the other is the 1996 film Basquiat, which is a drama, which pretty much it didn't introduce the world to Jeffrey Wright because he had a career before this, but it was, I think, his breakout role. And it was actually directed by Julian Schnabel, who was a contemporary of Jean-Michel Basquiat, the New York artist from the late 70s, early mid 80s, and a contemporary of Andy Warhol. Now, both Make Me Famous and Basquiat cross over because they're about the same city and the same time period, the same kind of art scene, and also very different outcomes for struggling artists in that art scene, and the way that art was sort of commodified and turned into something that it was not meant to be, and whose ripples echo into the future, into today, for better and worse. So we're going to talk about both of these things. But first, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm doing well. This is exciting. I was almost taken back to my early 80s when I was in art school. And so many of the topics that we were discussing then as young art students were things that were going on in the art scene, sort of the idea of commerce versus art, commercial art, what constituted an art career, various things like that, as well as just the excitement of, sort of this new decade and some new art movements, some new musical sort of genres coming out of sort of what was from the 60s and 70s, albeit now sort of turning into a little bit more of mass media and television and, dare I say, money to be made off of that, which both of these movies get into. So it was almost like sort of like taking the DeLorean back to the future for me. Is like it reminded me a lot of that. Suddenly I'm flooded with memories of that time. But both excursions, both films, if you will, were quite the head trip for me. So I enjoyed watching them, and I'll enjoy talking about them with you.
Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. Basquiat actually came out while I was in art school back in 1996. I was going into between my first and second years, and I think I saw it at the Fine Arts Theater in Chicago.
Oh, yes, that's
with my friend Sarah. Yeah.
Oh, I might have been sitting right next to you. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows?
I would not doubt it. There's too many coincidences like that in my life. But so why are we talking about both of these films? Well, first of all, Make Me Famous is going to be showing tomorrow night, Friday the 22nd, at the Highland Park Wayfarer Theater here in Illinois, in Highland Park, Illinois. Not only that, but after the 6 p.m. show, there's going to be a Q&A with the director Brian Vincent and producer Heather Spohr, who actually appear in the film. So that's very exciting. I'll have links to tickets and showtimes and all that information down below, so definitely check that out and make plans to see this on the big screen. And also, Criterion recently came out with Basquiat on shiny 4K. And I have a lot of thoughts about this release, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because it is not the film I remember, again, for better and for worse, possibly. So let's start with Make Me Famous. Well, actually, let's rewind. I want to ask you, Jeff, do you like art documentaries? Is it a big source of fascination for you as it is for me?
It is. In fact, I will be honest with you. I think the greatest challenge for a filmmaker today is to do something that helps explain art to people, because it is becoming more and more of a narrow world or window. And that's even what Make Me Famous is about. But I think doing biographies about artists or how art works, whether it's music, painting, sculpture, they're very tricky. But I see everyone that comes out, because as an artist and somebody who's traveled in that world for many years, and even as we talked about with school and everything, art school, it's such a challenging story to tell, because so much of it is inside your mind. Yes, you physically paint and sculpt and play music and strum guitars and stuff but the actual creative process is, I think, one of the hardest things to illustrate in a film that is a visual medium, because this is inside somebody's head, unless you film all the crazy thoughts that they have going on there, which most people don't do. It's a difficult narrative. And so whenever one is done, be a documentary or fiction or scripted film or even series or whatever, I'm very, very fascinated by it. So yeah, I seek them out. I will say this, most of them tend to be very disappointing. I am not a big fan of film bios for that very reason. I think most of them try to tell too much story. They don't tell the right points of the story. And I'll give you a quick example of that. I think Rocket Man was a fascinating story. I like Elton John as a performer, and I think Taron Egerton gave an Academy Award-worthy performance. If Rami Malek had won the year before for Bohemian Rhapsody, I think Taron Egerton would have been up for the Oscar that year and maybe even been front runner. But sometimes those things, well, we just did it last year, so we can't do it this year. But I loved Rocket Man up until the last third, when it concentrated on his drug problem. And I think his drug problem is an interesting chapter in Elton John's life. But I think what he did for AIDS research, and particularly his relationship with the young man, Ryan, why am I blanking his name right now? The young boy who died, and then sort of got Elton John out of his own head and to give back more to the world, and also think about parenting and all that, I think would have been a more uplifting, better third of it than the typical, oh, they always resort to drugs or, the great fall. That was my biggest problem with watching Basquiat today is, despite some of the great stuff in it, the performances I like, Schnabel's attempts to put sort of a little bit of an artist's sort of weird spin on it. He's economical with a lot of scenes. It's just that same story of great artist can't live with his art in his own head, and he ends up dying an early, premature, terrible death. So to make a very long answer to your question, I do like those movies, but I find them very taxing, and I approach them with a great deal of trepidation. I was worried about this one, but I have to say it really impressed the shit out of me. I was a big fan.
Me too. Aside from a couple of like weird narrative detours that we'll get into in a bit, and I'm just, for the sake of it, I'm going to put up the spoiler banner.
Sure,
because we
you
might get into some things that people don't want to have spoiled for them. So
right.
Be warned. But I will just say that Jeff and I do give this movie, Make Me Famous, a recommendation. So if you're inclined to go see it, I would say turn this off now, go see it, and then come back and watch us talk about it. But yeah, I'm a sucker for documentaries about artists and also dramas. I mean, a few of my favorites are Exit Through the Gift Shop, Jodorowsky's Dune, Pollock, Crumb, Comic Book Confidential, even Vincent and Theo, because they really get into, a lot of them do delve into the kind of the messed up lives of these, eccentric but great, important artists, but they also focus a lot on the creation of the artwork. You see Crumb drawing, you see Ed Harris as Jackson Pollock, like making these giant canvases. It's so easy to look at a picture of a Pollock painting and be like, why is that valuable or important? Or I could do that. There's also another documentary called My Kid Could Paint That, from like a couple 20 years ago or something. So there's something about being able to see the process of creation and understand that it is something extraordinary. There's this whole kind of way of thinking like everyone's creative, everyone's an artist. And to a certain extent that's true, but it's also, I think, kind of bullshit, because everybody has an instinct or an ability to, make a note come out of their mouth or put pen to paper, but that doesn't necessarily make them an artist. It is, I'm going to get pretentious here and say it's a je ne sais quoi, but and I think these kind of films really highlight that. And also they de-romanticize what it is to be an artist, because it's not, I would say it's rarely fun because when you're able to hole up and make something and create something, that can be a great and freeing experience. And the rest of the time you're walking around in your head, not making stuff, wishing you were making stuff, and wondering, why you're kind of at odds with the world. I think Make Me Famous is fascinating because we're talking about Edward Brezinski, a New York artist who lived in a slum on 3rd Street across from a men's shelter. And the whole landscape was full of, crumbling buildings, homeless people, junkies kind of passed out like everywhere. and he was living in absolute squalor, and he spent pretty much every dime he could on paint and painting materials.
Yep.
He would famously go to art gallery openings and art shows because they had booze and food, and he could sustain himself doing that, and also passing out these little homemade, business cards to a gallery show that might be in his apartment, just to kind of drum up interest. And maybe if he could sell something cheap, he could, find a few more bucks to live. I'll be honest, I had not heard of Brezinski before watching this documentary. And there are a lot of folks in here that I'm sure the kind of the art world and the art historians of contemporary, the contemporary scene, or contemporary back to 40 years ago, I guess, might recognize these names instantly. But there are a lot of new folks for me. And oddly enough, they did not come off as being folks that maybe I'd appreciate their work, but I wouldn't want to break bread with them, because there's some monsters in this documentary.
There are. In fact, I had very, very vaguely heard of Brzezinski. I think it was at the time when I was interested in watching a little bit more, studying a little bit more about sort of this neo-expressionism movement that they had in New York, particularly in the early 80s, and sort of a reaction to sort of, dare I say, the much more commercial America and world that we were starting to see then. And there was an emphasis on money and commerce, and greed is good, all that kind of stuff that we know the 80s has kind of become known for in many respects now. But it's interesting, because honestly, as I was watching it, Ian, I thought they could do a documentary on almost any of these artists in there. I mean, the story about McGough and McDermott is a fascinating one too, about how they were artists and they were lovers, and they tried to bring back all this old-fashioned world to the modern world, as sort of reaction against it, and how they lost their fortunes and fell out and then came back. But they're here just to talk about Brezinski, this contemporary of theirs, who they never thought was really a great artist, but they thought he was a great wannabe, I guess, is maybe the most generous way of saying what some of these terribly acidic and even rude people say about him and some other artists in the mix as well. Nothing succeeds like success, I guess, or it succeeds like success, but there's a bitterness across almost everybody who's on camera here talking, which I think is a fanciful kind of notion, because we always think artists is, they're expressing themselves and they have this outlet and stuff, and yet these people are as bitter even after they put it all on canvas and maybe made a living at it. But it's never less than fascinating, and I felt very sorry for Brezinski after watching this. I don't think his art was terrible. I think a lot of it was very interesting, just as interesting as some of the people who made it, which I think shows again that sometimes talent is, or a certain style is not all that it's the only thing that sort of writes your bio. It's sometimes luck and being in the right place at the right time, or having an advocate. But it is fascinating to watch him, because I think that is the story of more artists than not, whether they're painters, musicians, actors, the people who don't make it, who come close, are brushing up against the possibility of it, maybe even contemporaries of those who did make it. But this poor guy never made it. And the fact that there's very little of him actually talking on camera makes him all the more a mystery, because he's being defined by his peers, some of them not very flattering, with a great deal of flattery. And then the second half of the movie, which was very interesting, because it gets a little bit beyond just telling us about Brezinski's time in New York and his wanting to be famous and sell work, and his inability to, and his run-ins with different artists and gallery owners and promoters and stuff like that. And then the second half is he actually dead? Like, did he actually die? It becomes a little bit of a, I don't want to say true crime story, but it's like, is there a mystery to this? Because it turns into sort of one of those MSNBC, Dateline shows or whatever, like, is Edward Brezinski really dead? Let's talk to people and find out. We went all the way to Cannes and to Nice. So it's a lot going on here, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different sort of studies of artists in addition to Brezinski, but all of it, I almost wanted more of it. I kept wanting more of it, and I think that's a sign of a great film, especially a documentary. If they make you want to find out more about what's going on, they've really piqued your fancy and made you hunger for more.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. This happened the first time I saw Basquiat in '96. I instantly went out and looked for a book of his artwork and tried to find out more about him. That began my obsession with Andy Warhol.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, and Crumb is kind of the same way. But with this movie, I mean, the first thing that struck me about it is the image of Brzezinski. This is the early days of kind of like the consumer video camera, and you see glimpses of him in these kind of home movies that either friends shot or he shot, at these parties he would have or he would appear
Mhm.
at. He struck me, it looked like a young Michael Rosenbaum mixed with David Foster Wallace, but dressed like a Goodwill version of Bret Easton Ellis. He was always very much kind of like in a suit or trying to present
Yeah.
himself as
Mhm.
more, cultured. He did not look like a guy who lived in, I mean, the conditions that he was living in that we see glimpses of in these home movies is just, it's appalling.
He's
You wonder
always
how
clean
anyone,
shaven. In every
yeah.
shot we see him, he's shaved. I mean, there's no 2-day growth on him. It's like, you're right. He cleaned up pretty well, and did not look like the typical suffering artist. Um,
But
but
the
yeah, that was a shocker right off the bat.
But one of the things that I noticed about this doc, and as I mentioned, the whole like quest for fame and money and commerce, as opposed to the actual making of the art or what it might represent. This is also the early days of video, and what's kind of interesting to see is you get all these shots, especially early on, of people. It's almost like the apes in 2001 looking at the monolith. They're like looking kind of like in and around the camera. They're
Yeah,
not really sure
yeah,
where to look or what to do in front of it. It's
right.
it's fascinating, but these are all folks who, to some degree, they're kind of sensing, oh, this is a thing that can project my image out and maybe give me some kind of notoriety, even if it's only amongst my friends. Like, hey, look, I'm on camera, like they are in Hollywood. But as far as the the plight of him struggling as an artist, yeah, he's got a very strange, I guess, technique, a very strange style. It looks very simple, but what I really responded to, and this is why I think people should go see this on a big screen. I mean, I watched this on my laptop, and I was like, I wish I could see this projected 80 feet high. Is you look at his paintings, and they are deceptively simple because then you can look deeper into them and say, okay, he really captured in very not few strokes because they're more complex than that. Captured the essence of his subjects, because a lot of the times the people, his contemporaries, we see them today talking on camera, and you see old photographs of them or old video footage, and then you'll see the portrait that he drew of them. Like, my God, he nailed that person there. It's
Mhm.
not like he's Alex Ross painting, in a studio with all this perfect lighting, and he's slaving over this for days to get a great oil-like likeness. It was very crude. And oftentimes, as far as the technique of what went into making these, he would have people sit for him, but he would constantly be scratching out and wiping over his paintings
Mhm.
with turpentine, not
Mhm.
allowing them to see what he was doing,
Mhm.
and painting and repainting and repainting. And sometimes he'd get so frustrated that in one case, he took the back of his brush and stabbed through and desecrated the canvas entirely. So these kind of fascinating stories. But again, just looking at the final product and hearing about what went into making it, you realize it's not something that can be dismissed because it's simple. And I'm not
Right.
necessarily a fan of, like, when it comes to movies, like, oh, they worked really hard in this movie. Like, well, the end result is all that matters. The end result of his paintings were often, again, deceptively complex. You really had to sit with them for a while to get the essence out of it. And
Mhm.
I just sat with them for a couple of minutes, like watching this in this documentary, but I wanted to know, more.
Well, it's funny because I think you can tell there's a certain amount of training, certain amount of raw talent there, even if it's done with this sort of simplistic or sort of rough style. It reminded me somewhat of Gauguin's paintings, and certainly, Moreau, and some of the more, simple kinds of things, which every time somebody says it's simple, you know how hard it is to get it to be very simple. It's a lot of erasing and honing and starting over, and you think something in your head and it's not quite translating to what you want on the page. But you're right. His portraits of people, I think, were rather stunning, and quite often his self-portraits were very telling too. And some of the editorializing that he did about sort of the AIDS epidemic was particularly interesting, as that was really getting underway in the 80s. And they make a great deal in the movie about his portrait of Nancy Reagan and sort of how he portrayed her. And you can read a lot into it, but I think it's a very editorialized interpretation of her. She's instantly recognizable with the big head and the hairdo and the sort of red suit and stuff. But then, they talk about how she's poised almost like a ballerina, like there's almost a dance to sort of what she was doing, and these sort of like, oh, let's just say no, which is, maybe not as deep and as sort of sort of nuanced a real attack on a drug problem at the time or whatever. And then there's also, the fact that he doesn't give a lot to her face, which is sometimes, not necessary. I mean, God knows in caricature, you can sometimes get somebody's essence with no features, just the shape of their head or a certain pose or something. But, there's a lot going on, a lot of thought put into this. And I think that he was underrated in many respects compared to some of the people that we see presented alongside him, who are much more successful and standing today as acclaimed artists who have money, et cetera, et cetera. But it is interesting to know that for Brezinski, and I think for all of these people, as well as probably for any artist, and maybe it's why we have become sort of interested in celebrity so much, is their real life is as fascinating often as their art is. And a lot of times it goes hand in hand. The torture soul that was Edgar Allan Poe showed up on the page. I think sometimes the perfectionist that Bob Fosse was, and his constant need to push the boundaries of editing and sex and self-flagellation and different things like that in his films showed up, whether he was doing a story about Lenny Bruce or himself as Joe Gideon and all that jazz. And I think the documentary, without actually having Brezinski able to say much about his life or show, himself in retrospect, looking back at himself 30, 40 years ago, it is fascinating because I think they give a very full portrait of not only him, but his time and his reaction to that time, which I think is really quite a lot from a documentary, because they could have just made it about where he fit in sort of the art pantheon, and he didn't really make it. He wasn't successful. There's a bitterness to it. I mean, even the title, Make Me Famous, is like, some artists say, well, he mostly wanted to be famous. I disagree. He painted all the time. He was constantly working. He wanted to, I think, be famous, as somebody said in it. I think it was Joseph Maschek, the art historian. So he made money to be able to do what he wanted without fear of, am I commercial enough, or is this going to sell, or can I pay the rent? But it is a very fascinating portrait of him and all these other artists and that period as well. It also, let me just point out another thing that I think is fascinating too, is, again, this is one of the things is always a theme when I do movie critiques, is the context of the time. The movie, does it stand up today? Great, it does. Wonderful. Some people don't understand, well, what was it? Well, you have to understand the time period it came on and why they didn't have great special effects, or why it was this way, or maybe why it was a little racist or sexist, whatever you want to call it. But this is very much a reaction to the New York 70s and the 70s as a whole time in this country, when people were on edge and they were coming off of the government's lies of Watergate and Vietnam, and issues with civil rights and women's rights and sexual revolution and the queer nation and things like that, as well as economic disparity. I mean, whip inflation now is a very trying time, and yet suddenly then we cruise into the 80s and it's all much more about commercial and mass media and different things like that. And New York started to get transformed by Giuliani. They don't say it as explicitly here, but all that is at play here too. And then, some of these places which were terrible to live in, but maybe inspiring for artists in a way, were getting, sort of cleaned up and everything else. So all that becomes a very fascinating historical portrait as well.
Yeah. And, one of the questions, I don't know if it was Siskel or Ebert or somebody, but, or maybe some of you unrelated to them, said that one question to ask whenever you're watching a movie, especially a documentary, is, why is this being made now?
Mm-hmm.
What's the significance of it? And I think Make Me Famous, they don't draw this comparison in the movie, but I think they could have, if they had done away with some of that, like, is he alive business, which we'll get, to later. But the whole idea of, what do we have today? We've got an entire generation of people who are creating content. They are content creators. They are artists in a certain respect because they're making stuff all the time.
Right.
But it's in a constant thirsty quest to be noticed, to be appreciated, to be famous. And we're seeing a lot of that on a much grander and even global scale than what was happening in New York in the early 80s. There was I can't remember which subject it was, but someone was talking about Brzezinski's mania to be noticed, which I think was a great phrase. It's not necessarily to be famous, but to be noticed, to be recognized, because he was, as you were pointing out, putting in the work, as were his contemporaries. But he was constantly painting, constantly hustling. But I think a lot of people, as we saw in some of the people they talked to for the film, they thought he was a joke. Like, oh, here's the guy who's coming into this gallery opening and passing out cards for his next show. You just don't do that. It's improper form. He was constantly chasing trends in his own way. When Warhol came out with the Marilyn portraits, he was doing a very crude Bianca Jagger kind of meme and different, kind of the same style but different forms.
Or painting different people multiple times and having exhibits about the 6 or 7 times he did a portrait of that one woman.
Right.
Yeah.
And he got into screen printing, or which Warhol was into. There was the story about the stenciling. Sorry. The gallery he went to, and I don't remember, I'm blanking on the artist's name, but he did the kind of the airbrushed paintings on the backs of leather jackets. Brzezinski got the sense, hey, I can do that. So he went and he painted one of his Nancy Reagans and then ran into a gallery. The paint was still wet and it all got smeared off on the other guests. So he was constantly he was just the guy. He was Charlie Brown with the football. He just could not catch a break, and he wasn't taken seriously by his contemporaries. Even people talking about him today, or when this documentary was filmed, there is not much of a sadness of his passing. It was almost like, oh yeah, he was that quirky guy that I used to know like 40 years ago. And it is sad, because much like today, there's a lot of people who just want to be recognized. Fame would be great, but just someone to call them out and recognize their talent or their desire to be noticed among the millions and millions of content creators out there. No, I'm not talking about me. Okay, maybe I am, but but there's a melancholy to the heart of this picture that is sort of underscored by the fact that none of the people who are being interviewed seem particularly troubled that he's gone.
I agree with that, and I think you hit on a number of things that make this so relevant to today, and why it's important for people to watch this film. And I think they'll get a lot out of it, whether they're artists or not, because I think it's about, to your point, this need to sort of be noticed. And I think, they trace some of it back to his family with the troubles in there. And I think, you can always look at the cliches of people who become very famous are oftentimes people who were not noticed, or were kind of wallflowers, or come from troubled homes, or looking for love, as I think Roxy Hart said in Chicago. And that's show business, folks, because we're all looking for love some way, shape, or form. I think he was wanting the attention, and those desperate moves were, hey, I can do that too. This isn't anything more talented than what I'm doing. It's just timing. It's just the opportunity. So I'm going to play off it too, the same way that this person is getting the break, because they happen to be getting this right when people have, their eyes looking at them. There was a desperation of that, because I think he felt, I am putting in the work. I do have some thought. I am making these portraits that are interesting and have some real commentary and artist point of view on them. And yet it wasn't necessarily breaking through like some of the other people. I mean, it's interesting. You look at Keith Haring and some of the people who did break through. And I mean, I'm a Keith Haring fan, but some of what he was doing seems as simplistic as some of the other stuff that people were talking about either. But I think his became maybe a little bit more easily identifiable because of the very specific way, and he connected everything. And so suddenly that takes off. And, you never know how something's going to hit or become famous. But to your point, suddenly the 80s with cable exploding and video exploding, and now film was art, video was art, it was a different expression. There became almost a mania, to your point, about, wait a minute, how am I going to get noticed when all this other stuff is going on, and the zone is being flooded with artists. And I think that made his sort of tragic story all the greater, is that maybe his timing was bad, in the sense that if he had been born 20 years earlier, some of the things he was doing, or the mindset he was doing, would have gotten him interest. But get in line. There's, dozens of others who were just like that, and they show up in this movie. Some more successful than others. Some were luckier at the time, or maybe became famous with time. But it's interesting. Walter Robinson, one of the artists who did make it, said, I believe he was the one who quoted, said that we're all just oddballs trying to find a place to fit in. And I think that's kind of, if there's sort of a way of saying a sort of motto for all artists, be they singers, artists, writers, actors, whatever. They tend to be people who have a certain way of thinking, a certain way of expressing themselves, which is not the normal person's, because most people, to your point, I agree, aren't creative. They may have creativity in them, but being creative is actually putting it down or putting it out there somehow, and maybe editing it or trying to make it better or cultivating it, which, anybody can scribble down something and, oh, that's not a bad drawing if I said try to draw this vase in front of you, but to make it look really good or to give it a point of view and stuff like that, that takes thought, and that's what art is. And those people tend to be, from very young on, a little bit eccentric, a little bit unusual, and certainly the classes and their peers are not always the kindest to those folks. They are the oddballs, and I thought this whole movie is about that. And in some respects, I think Brezinski's great flaw was that he was this oddball who didn't look like it, wasn't necessarily fitting into a time that was moving more and more away from that. And his struggle to figure out who he is, where his art was, and where that art could fit in.
I think about Haring, and I think about Basquiat, and I think about Warhol. They all had very distinct looks and kind of big personalities or kind of enigmas to them.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at Brzezinski, he almost had that sort of a classical portraiture, but filtered through that very rushed, deceptively simplistic style. So maybe it could be something like where you look at it and you almost don't notice it because, like, oh, I could do that, or it looks like he was not quite talented enough to make it as a great master portraiture or portraitist.
Right.
But it's ironic because he is perhaps most famous, at least from what I gather in this documentary, not from the work that he did, but from some of his public stunts. I mean, there's Robert Gober, Robert Gober.
Yes,
Was an artist who the movie almost, it's not quite a bookend, but it opens with this kind of anecdote, and it kind of in the climax or towards the climax, we're talking about Brzezinski's legacy. It comes back into play, but there is an art opening where there are these kind of pedestals that had kind of objects that Gober had recreated, but sort of preserved everyday objects. And one of them was a bag of donuts. And they were actual donuts that had been, coated in, I think it was formaldehyde.
Yeah, that's right.
And just sitting in a bag. And this was an $8,000 art item. And so Brzezinski went to the opening. He was kind of appalled by all this stuff he was saying, because here he is sitting in his, slum studio, painting day after night after day after night and trying to make something, interesting. And here's a guy who's just like, yeah, I spray coated a bunch of food, and now I'm going to sell it to people who don't know any better. So he actually goes into one of the bags of donuts, and he takes one out and starts devouring it. And then very quickly, I think it was Gober or someone else said, look, those are coated in a very, very toxic substance. You need to get your stomach pumped now.
Yeah.
And that was, that caused quite a stir. It made some papers, but also kind of made news because he made it news. I think he was the one who Brzezinski called up the newspaper and said, hey, you'll never believe what happened to this crazy art gallery.
That's right. He called. Yeah, he was sort of, realizing that it took a certain amount of promotion, and if he couldn't get an agent, he was going to promote himself. And yeah, that ultimately, up until maybe this documentary, was the primary thing that he was known for. And of course, other artists tended to laugh at that. But it's also interesting because I think this documentary works on a number of levels. I think it works on a examination of just art, as well as that time period, a failing artist or an artist who didn't really succeed and yet did have talent. And then I also think on sort of the art world, and dare I say, why it isn't particularly relevant anymore. And really in the 80s, I would argue it started to become more and more irrelevant. You see how niche this often was, appealing to a certain very, very tiny sliver of New York trend setters or tastemakers, if you will, and getting their attention from the art critic world or the magazines or, the New York papers and such. It was also, I think a time when there was a lot of debate about technician versus artist, as they often talk in this documentary about. In fact, I think it's interesting that they show James Romberger, who was a successful artist, came out of this movement, but most of his art, as you look at it, was him letting you see how technician-wise he was about. He was very good at accurately capturing body parts and perspective and, sort of a realism, even if it was applied to sort of cartooning and some of those kind of things that were close to that. There was a big big argument made in the late 70s, maybe even earlier, about the fact that we had gone the entire 40s, 50s, and 60s and not recognized commercial art as an art form. Norman Rockwell was not being hung in museums. The people who created the comic books weren't. The people who did comic strips that were the number one reason that people were buying newspapers, they weren't put in and hung in museums either. Roy Lichtenstein was, for blowing up panels and making fun of comic art, but the actual people doing comic art for decades and making it arguably in some respects the most saleable art form in the world and became as popular as Impressionism, which was its version of commercial art in Europe in that century. That stuff was being ignored, and there's a certain amount that this touches here with that too. And I think for people like Brezinski and some of the others, they realize that PR, promotion, stunting, calling and getting your name in the paper was the same as doing great art, because it all needed some help. And yet it's also funny that there was this snobbery towards stuff that, I think of one of the great artists at the time who also died of AIDS early and it only started, was the great Richard Amzell, who did wonderful movie posters and TV guide covers and stuff. And, they probably all sneered at somebody like that, though he was in New York too. And some of the other people who came out of that period. I have a acquaintance and sort of a friend online named Robert Risco, who is one of the premier caricaturists of the last 30 years. And he came out of that time period too. He was the artist who was showcased in Andy Warhol's Interview magazine for the better part of a decade, and still contributes to Vanity Fair. But I think his work and his ability to find a sort of fresh, modern way to both celebrate and laugh at celebrity, as I think a lot of his work really was sort of wonderfully editorializing on, is just as significant. And yet there's people who would not put Robert Risco in the same breath as Warhol. And yet I would argue that at some point when art becomes noticed and becomes liked or talked about, as the one, I think it was David McDermott said, art has to wow. You have to look at it and say, wow. You can't just go, oh, that's interesting, or, oh, that's kind of thought-provoking or whatever. It's got to kind of hit you. I'm not sure that's always exactly the case, but I think people whose work continually impresses people, that you seek it out or you want to see more of it, or it does continually wow you, be it Warhol, be it Risco, be it some of the wonderful artists here. I think all those are discussion points that this movie gets into, which is fascinating. But I think it shows that the art world is tricky. I remember one time there was a Time magazine article calling Jasper Johns the greatest artist of the last 30 years or something like that. And I like Jasper Johns. I think he's a terrific artist. But was he better than some of the people who drew for Marvel, or Walt Kelly, who wrote Andrew Pogo, or some of those real craftsmen? Jeff McNally, who used to be the chief political cartoonist for the Chicago Tribune, to me is one of the greatest artists of the last 50 years. His draftsmanship, his perspective, and his ability to cartoon and then do it daily and put politics or opinion and savagery or humor behind it is genius. And yet I don't know if anybody talks about Jeff McNally in the same breath as somebody like a Warhol, who I love Warhol too, but I think there's room for all these artists. And this movie gets at a little bit of that snobbery, and I think how it held a lot of the art world back, because they were a very shut off, very sort of circular, tribe.
Well, it's
insulated tribe.
Well, it's also fascinating because there are the brand names, Haring, Warhol, Basquiat. But then a lot of the artists, and again, this could just be my ignorance. I'm here in the suburbs of Chicago, that I'm not a New York art scene gadfly. But a lot of the folks that are interviewed here in their kind of galleries or their kind of posh living rooms or
Right,
workspaces,
right.
they're folks that apparently have done very well for themselves, but I have no idea who they are, but
Yep.
they think that everybody knows who they are. So
Right.
you've got like the superstars, you've got the local talent, and then you've got the folks who never quite made it. So you do have the full spectrum. But what I loved about Make Me Famous is it's not as obvious as that. It's not sectioned off to profile these different kind of strata. It's just something that sort of comes together as you're watching the piece.
For sure.
I also love that we get a look into Julian Schnabel's artwork, something that I hadn't really noticed before because I've seen his stuff, but I didn't really know the backstory. And sometimes I think that's kind of unfair, of like having to know the backstory of something in order to fully
Right.
appreciate it. But in this case, talks about him being a dishwasher in New York, and then his art, or what kind of brought him to prominence, was smashing dishes, kind of gluing them to these giant canvases and then painting portraits over that, like in this kind of like weird 3D topography. I had not really looked at his work before until I noticed, wait a second, those are all dishes. I thought they were just weird, I don't know what I thought they were, but I just thought it's just jagged painting. But now it's even more fascinating, and that'll come into play, I think, even more when we talk about Basquiat in a minute. But the one thing I will say about Make Me Famous that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I would probably have taken it out to focus on some of the other areas that we've discussed here, is in the middle of the movie, there's a very jarring break. Now, up until the midpoint, we'd seen, let's see, I want to make sure I get it. Yeah, it is. Sorry. We'd seen the director, Brian Vincent, in the movie, I think, once in one scene. In this midpoint, we hear a narrator, which is something we hadn't seen before in the first like 40 minutes of this movie, breaking in to say, but wait, did he actually die in, did Brezinski actually die in Nice? There seem to be conflicting stories. What's going on here? And then like a Google screenshot comes up and they're typing that in, and then they type it into, I can't remember what the other website was, but all of a sudden it becomes a very different kind of movie.
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry.com. That's what it was. I wanted to say TripAdvisor, but that's completely,
well, they did take a couple trips overseas to find out, but anyway, go ahead.
They did, but all of a sudden at this midway point, Brian Vincent and his producer, they both become characters in this movie, along with a couple of the other subjects who decide to fly over to France to track down these conflicting reports of, is Edward Brezinski alive or dead? And there's like conflicting like hospital records, and maybe he didn't even die in Nice, but somewhere else. We've got the spoiler banner up, but I want to save some mystery for folks, even if they've already seen it. But I got this weird kind of a Michael Moore feeling. They're not as showboaty as he is, but for a documentary that had just been about talking heads and images and voiceovers, to suddenly have these characters appear in a narrative through line, it just kind of threw me for a loop. I'm like, I don't like this. And I felt like the same effect could have been achieved, with a little bit of tinkering, and just have them off screen, or have other people talk about this trip that they embarked on. It's the only thing I think I appreciated was when Vincent was interviewing Eric Bogosian, but that's just because I'm obsessed with Eric Bogosian. I didn't like the latter part of this documentary as much as the former. They do kind of rebound once they resolve the life-death thing, and it has a pretty good ending. But yeah, it was jarring, and I was thinking to myself, is this sort of a meta commentary, a meta version of the very artwork that came out of that period, of taking your expectations of what a traditional documentary is supposed to be and putting a lightning bolt of new energy and excitement and difference into the middle of it to make you reevaluate what you think about the form, and can you appreciate something that is not what you expected? And the answer for me is, I appreciate what he did here. I just don't like it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's bisected. I mean, it literally is the first hour is this sort of straightforward documentary, brilliantly told with all these interviews. I mean, they've covered the gamut of getting all these comments, the footage they've got, the pictures. There's very little that's repeated, and that's always a sign of a really well done documentary, is that they don't have to keep going back to the same Getty images or whatever, you know. And even if they don't have a literal shot of it, they'll show like, well, this is a shot from, you know, that time period, and we'll use it here even if it's not necessarily associated with a photographer or film historian from the subject material. But yeah, the second half becomes a little bit more of a detective story. Like, did he really die, and what happened to him over in Europe, and why was he there? And the good news is that at least they weave in all these people still talking about it, including his death, or whether they knew that he had died or heard about this mystery surrounding it. But yeah, you're right. Brian Vincent and Heather Spohr become major characters in it, as do Marguerite Van Cook and James Romberger, who were you know, contemporaries who were commenting on this. But suddenly they're now going over, and these four people are sort of becoming, you know, sort of sleuths, if you will. It doesn't, I think, damage it as much as maybe it did for your viewing, but it is a different way to go. I also thought it was playing up a little bit, maybe becoming almost sort of a commentary in itself, not only on just the way you said that they're mixing up and sort of doing different things with the expectations of tropes of documentaries, but I think they were being a little meta about, of course, all artists die, you know, and they all have to end with that, whether it's Freddie Mercury or Jim Morrison or whomever, they all end up somehow dead in a bathtub at 28 or something, you know, which is so often the case in these biographies. 9 times out of 10, if there's some great artist, it's going to end with that person dead and early. And sure enough, this one does too. So they're just doing the part of like, well, here's how we found out all that and whether or not he really was dead or not. And of course, ultimately, again, I'm not going to give it all away. To your point, let's leave something for everybody to discover on their own. But I think it fits. It's a fitting sort of part of the tragedy of his life and death in a way that fits with the entirety of it. But it is a little surprising, I grant you. But I have to say, up until then, the research, the amount of access, the ability to paint a picture, the ability to sort of put it all in context from Vincent and Spohr is very, very strong. And I love the fact that they get somebody like Eric Bogosian to talk about here too, because he came out of that time as well, and he's had a lasting career and become, you know, a character actor who's worked now for 40 plus years in Hollywood. Good for him. So, you know, some of it is perseverance and some of it is, you know, sheer will. But there's so much on the screen. I would almost recommend to people, once you've seen it at the movie theater tomorrow night, find it on VOD if you can, or because I think it's worth watching a second time. I want to watch it a second time.
Yeah, I mean, me too. And again, I think just visually, it sounds strange, but a lot of the kind of the establishing shots of that Third Street kind of slum they lived in, it's beautiful. I mean, just like the sheer industrial carnage, and it's almost like a cartoon. It's like one building standing, barely standing, amidst like just, you know, vacant lots. But I will say, as far as the mystery and all that stuff. And I'm probably going to give it away even though I'm going to try and delicately describe it, they go through a lot in order to get to a conclusion that could have just been a sentence and moved on
5
to
minutes
some
of the film if you really wanted to just economize it and make more of some other parts of the period of the 80s that Brezinski and his contemporaries were very, very involved in.
Right, because if you're going to play this up like, ooh, could he really be alive? Unless the answer is yes.
Yeah. It's, you know, it's much ado about nothing in a way. Yeah.
Taking plane trips and checking into hotels is not compelling cinema. I'd rather get back to some of those other folks talking about
I'll go one further than what you're sort of saying, Ian, though I think you are saying in a way, but I think what they could have done is minimize the detective work, come to the conclusion of what they were thinking was a mystery early, done in a shorter amount of screen time, and then talked about how after that his work was recognized or was sort of shown in galleries along with contemporaries, or, you know, provided a reevaluation of him because oftentimes that happens when people die, right up to the point where if you want, oh, that's right, we're making a documentary about this somewhat obscure unknown artist. I think the aftermath of that would have been more interesting than just the procedural of it, like it's a cop show in a way. But up until then, I think it was riveting for anybody to understand the world we live in, how celebrity and time and access. And I loved your comparison, and they don't say it directly, which is another sort of attribute of this, but it's not just about content. It's really so much about just filling slots. Like we've got this period to film now because every cable station, has to be 24/7. I mean, they used to sign off at midnight when I was a kid, or 2 a.m. on a Saturday, maybe after the late show, but they played the Star Spangled Banner, and then it was Betty Bet, go to bed time until the farm report at 6 a.m. or whatever. And now everybody is about, well, we've got to fill content. We've got to fill slots. We'll repeat things. We'll have reruns. It's all a bunch of blather. I mean, even our news today is, you watch any news show on cable television, and it's no more news than the half hour that they have on ABC, NBC, and CBS at 5:30 Central Time. It's a little bit of news and a lot of talk about the news, which is kind of weird too, that we're all evaluating it as we just find out about it. Wait a minute, can we editorialize on that? Time Magazine waited a week because they wanted to put it in contest and think about it for a day or so and then write about it. But same with the art world here. It's like everything is content. Everybody fancies themselves a filmmaker if they're doing 2-minute videos on TikTok. And are they content makers? Yes, but and gladly they call themselves content makers, but that's not necessarily an artist. And just because you know how to hold a cell phone camera and shoot somebody talking doesn't make you a filmmaker. And yet I would be willing to bet that a lot of people today would argue vehemently against that take on it. And this film gets at that without explicitly saying so. But these were people who were artists trying to make an impression, trying to make a difference, trying to comment on the world they were living and reacting to. And I think more often than not, it's about likes and eyeballs and clicks.
Yeah, very much so. And also, I just want to make clear and speak for Jeff and myself. We are not denigrating content creators.
No, there's lots of great stuff out there.
But because I
mean, TikTok. There's so many clever people on there, but not everybody's clever. Not everybody's an artist on there or anywhere else.
But also, much like the kind of the art world of New York in the 70s and 80s we're discussing here, there are people who kind of break out of that form and become superstars in their own right. I mean, the Philippou brothers started off making comedy shorts on YouTube, and then they came out with Talk to Me and Bring Her Back. Chris Stuckman, who's a YouTube film critic, his new horror movie is about to debut. So yes, there is the potential for people to hone their craft in this medium and then do something that kind of elevates what they're doing into something bigger that deserves recognition. But it's certainly not all of it. It's impossible for everything to be great art because there's a billion YouTube channels out there and TikTok creators and all that other stuff, which I think is great. I'd rather have people doing and creating and thinking about stuff than not. But to your point, we live in such a frenzied attention economy that it's almost impossible to come up with something profound, or if you do, to have it stand out and have anybody pay attention to it. I do want to transition to Basquiat, because there's a particular amount of crossover here, and it's context that Make Me Famous helped me to appreciate about Basquiat, which I've seen this movie probably half a dozen times in my life, but things that I'd never known. Like, let me see. I just want to get again. Sorry, Anina Nosei was a gallery owner in
both films.
She was in. The real person was in Make Me Famous. She was a gallery owner, and then she shows up in Basquiat, playing a character playing her as the gallery owner. I did not pick up on that. I didn't know her significance. I didn't know her relationship to those characters. And that's sort of one of my problems with Basquiat as a film. It is very much a series of vignettes strung together in an autobiographical fashion, if you will, but you don't really get to know these characters or who they are or their significance. If you didn't know who Andy Warhol is, going into Basquiat, let's just say this is your first, experience with anything art world wise, you probably wouldn't even understand who or why he's significant. He's just like this strange guy being played by David Bowie. Even though I like a lot of the performances and I love a lot of the actors who are in Basquiat, I feel at some point it is just like a glorified episode of The Love Boat. Like who's the star that's going to show up in this scene and be like, oh my God, it's Christopher Walken, who I think has probably the best
I
scene
agree.
with
The best
Jeffrey
scene in
Wright
the
and
movie is
Basquiat
that one.
this
Yep.
prolonged interview sequence. And he's not playing a weird version of Christopher Walken. He's almost, I think one of the things so striking is he's just playing it sincere. Like, I'm going to be a journalist interviewing an artist.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to rewind a bit and talk about this 4K that came out from Criterion, because when I put it on last night, I hadn't read anything about it. I wasn't prepared, and I hadn't seen the film in probably a decade. And it started out, I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. This the kind of flashback to a young Jean-Michel Basquiat with his mother going to an art gallery, and she starts weeping at this painting, and she looks down and she sees that her son has this bright glowing golden crown on his head. And I'm like, I remember that crown being golden. Why is it in black and white? I'm like, oh, maybe I'm misremembering it, and there was like black and white sequences of the movie. No, the entire film was in black and white. So I paused it and I went online. I'm like, oh, the 4K version from Criterion is a special black and white remastered treatment of the film. The colored version is on Blu-ray on accompanying disc. And it turns out that years ago, Julian Schnabel was showing the film in, I don't know, was it the Hamptons or someplace in New York. And there was a problem with the projector, so it only showed the movie in black and white. And he fell in love with that version. And so he decided to George Lucas it, with Criterion making this kind of an official release. I don't like it.
Well, it doesn't seem to fit either with Basquiat, who was so interesting in combining type and color and texture and juxtaposing those things against each other. Oftentimes, I mean, there's a famous scene in the movie where he's trying to sell it to these two rich people, and Tatum O'Neal plays a woman who can't get over the fact that the green that he's using is institution green, and it just unsettles her. And she keeps saying, well, I love it, but I just don't know. And this is sort of the change of art. It reminds me of that scene with Daniel Stern and Max von Sydow in Woody Allen's, I think it was it Hannah and her sisters? Was that where they did? But that they're wanting to buy the art, and they're worried about how big it is versus the living room, and that's what art sometimes became, those kind of buyers. And they have money too. Might as well sell to them and be quiet, I guess. But it rubbed Max von Sydow as an artist very, very wrong. And same as it sort of rubs Basquiat here wrong as well. But I think the black and white thing is dare I say, Mr. Schnabel, kind of a cliche artsy fartsy choice, because if we put it in black and white, it's art, it's more meaningful. But I think Basquiat's life was very colorful and his work was very colorful. It seems like it's a misrepresentation of what you're trying to say about him as both a personality and his actual products, the things he produced, the art. Excuse me, not products. But I'm with you about your first point too, is that I think, excuse me, one of the issues with this film that I had not seen it in probably 20 years. I saw it twice when it was in the theater, and then here now. If you don't know some of this stuff, you're not going to know who this is. And they shorthand people like Warhol. And I think Warhol becomes, in so many regards, these kind of movies, just the cliche of the crazy wig and sort of flitty to gibbet about sort of commentary and stuff. And yet he was a great artist. He was very smart, and what he perceived and the way he talked about it and went through different periods and stuff is fascinating. And there's been stuff on him plenty too, but when they have him as a supporting character here and they don't explain him properly or give much context, it might leave people scratching their heads. I think in some respects, the one criticism I have about this movie is I think it was actually too quiet. I think these characters are all very interesting. They had a lot to say. One of the reasons I think that scene with Christopher Walken plays so well is he's kind of baiting the artist that Basquiat is, and yet Basquiat is sort of remaining cool and kind of keeping up with them. But he knows he's onto what he's doing a little bit. He's still offended, but he's onto the need for him to sort of lessen his stance and maybe even put him in a certain context as a sort of DEI, if you will, as we sometimes call it today. But there's too much silence in this movie. I mean, relationships are just sort of there. I mean, even Gina, suddenly Gina's, his girlfriend, and we don't really get a chance to see them really interact together. We get the clever first start of them when he puts the maple syrup on the table and starts creating a piece of art on the table. But, those sort of things, and she's the love interest in it, are just not as explored as possible. I mean, she gets mad at him for painting on her dress and ruining a dress she wanted to wear out. And literally 60 seconds later, they're back and fine. It's like, well, give that scene 3 more minutes, Mr. Schnabel. Let's see what that argument actually played out as. I doubt that it was done in 45 seconds. Let's see a meeting of minds and discussions. I think, say what you will, but that's one of the things I liked about When Harry Met Sally, is just as a romantic study of two people, they did an awful lot of conversing. And I think that's where relationships are done, and it can be done with great fascination. And this movie just kind of misses that. Suddenly he becomes famous, and yet he still has issues and is still living cheaply and crazily. And it's like, why is that? Who does he tell that to? Does he have an explanation for it? He has. He was very vocal. He's written stuff. Schnabel has written stuff too. Neither of them exactly were short for expression vocally, but you don't see much of that in the film.
Well, you wouldn't know that. I mean, watching Wright's performance, I think Jeffrey Wright does a great job, creating a character.
Yes.
I just don't know how true to life this is, to the real Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of, we see kind of like, even in Make Me Famous, we see some of those shots of him at galleries and these kind of like magazine covers and the glitz and the glamour. We don't really get a sense of that in this movie. And also there's, Courtney Love has an appearance as Big Pink, which is just a lady walking down a street, and Basquiat, picks her up even though he's got a girlfriend. So I don't know if this is meant to be shorthand for he slept around. Did he sleep around with just one person, or is a lot of people? At one point he's kind of picking at sores on his face. Is that because of the drugs he's on, or does he have AIDS? It turns out he died of a heroin overdose at the end, but there's all these like little corners that the movie keeps ducking into, but never really exploring. And there's these commercial style blackouts. I mean, this film would never appear on television, but it's like, okay, here's one scene. We're going to raise some questions and not answer any of them. And then we're going to jump into something else. We jump around in time. Like, to your point, he's not famous. And then he's famous because he says something like there's a time shift between like 1979, 1983. I'm like, wait, we skipped the entire process of him on the come up and his, relationship with Warhol. We see them meet, but we don't get the significance of it. We have more of a relationship between him and Warhol's, art manager promoter, played by Dennis Hopper. But my question is, if this movie had been cast with like regular New York character actors, say, and not celebrities, would anybody be talking about it now?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's funny. I mean, again, I think it's difficult in a 2-hour movie to capture so much of somebody's life, but Basquiat had a very, very expansive life, a very successful life. To your point, not only, the profiles and the money and the galleries and all that, but he was very much part of the celebrity circles. He did not live like a poor man. He dated a lot of different women. He had done so much cocaine that at one point he broke or deviated septum and had a hole in his nose. And some of those kind of things that were sort of the fallout of fame and sort of traveling in the circles where that was all very, evident and around in those days, they don't go into so much. But, they kind of make it out like he's this sort of lost soul, quiet, dare I say, slash artist slash junkie sometimes in it. And I think his life was much more fascinating and complex and maybe even intellectual than this movie portrays. Again, I think more often than not, as artsy fartsy as some of this movie is, and some of the cutaways of the video stuff, and Schnabel was into experimenting in his own life, let alone as a filmmaker, so good for him for that. But I think it is a very incomplete portrait, and unfortunately my biggest criticism of other than the lack of dialogue to explain what's going on and who these people are and what their real thoughts are, it falls into those cliches. I think it's fascinating. The walk-in scene is fascinating, not only because it goes on for like 5 minutes and there's real back and forth, but the reporter that Walken is playing starts out kind of complimenting him, but then he slowly but surely starts to bait him, and Basquiat figures it out and is sort of both being forthcoming and challenging, but also kind of just like, I'm not going to get into the dirt with you on this. But the fact is, Basquiat was giving interviews all over the place and was talking all the time about his art. And, it was interesting. Why is the first scene we've seen of Basquiat, he gets out of a box that he slept in Central Park or whatever at night, when he came from a middle-class background and he had revenue streams, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they could have gone into more of that, because I think one of the things that Basquiat did, like the artists in the previous movie you talked about, is there was a certain amount of presentation to themselves in artists which would get ink. And he was conscious of that as well. So he was not a dumb bunny who just was so eccentric that, sometimes you like to sleep outside. No, I think this man was a little smarter than all that, just as Warhol and a lot of these people were, about the fact that, hey, I'm not living in a cave. I know what the world's going on. I know that the art world is becoming more commercial, and they're looking for famous people. And Picasso and some of these people were as famous for their crazy lifestyles. Salvador Dali was a great self-promoter with his, shots. And I mean, he became probably more famous than, a lot of his paintings were at the time, because he was this eccentric artist that they profiled and was doing stuff with. So I think it's an interesting movie. I still like a lot of it. I think it's fascinating to see Jeffrey Wright doing the performance, where he's not in that sort of Jeffrey Wright voice. He doesn't use that at all in this. So what happened to Jeffrey Wright? Now he's like, hey, brother, I'm in the CIA, or hey, man, I'm just letting the Batman come and look at this crime scene because he knows what's going on, or hey, this isn't even a true story and this woman's getting a claim for it, that kind of stuff. But there's so many things that could have been done better in this movie but I think it's part of the problem with artist movie bios.
Well, one thing I noticed about the voice thing is key, because it doesn't sound like Jeffrey Wright has sounded like in anything since that I've seen. But in Make Me Famous, they have a clip from this movie called Downtown 81 in which Basquiat appears, and the voice that you hear sounds like a modern day Jeffrey Wright. It is kind of deep. Hey, I'm walking with my painting here. I'm like, wait a second, what's going on? But yeah, it's the thing about Basquiat, and this I think really came through. It might have helped me reassess the movie, because as I've seen it, as I've said, I've seen it, a number of times, and there's always something that kind of, I'm fascinated by it, I think, because of the performers and the performances, but something kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Watching it in black and white, which automatically put me on an uneven footing with it. Maybe it helped me analyze it more. There's an essay by Roger Durling on criterion.com, which I'll link to in the description. He's talking about this. And he says, in black and white, Schnabel's cinematic composition is at the forefront, not the art. And later there's a quote from Schnabel saying, the black and white version compresses the paintings into the fabric of the story, Schnabel tells me, and brings an extreme focus to the sadness and the poignancy of the trials of Jean-Michel's time in the art world without the art getting in the way. We don't have to judge it. That's, I think, it's great for the filmmaker's ego, but a big problem when you're making a movie about an artist. And one of the things that I think the thing that draws anybody to an artist is the artwork. And the art is so colorful beyond the institutional green that you described. I remember vividly sitting in that, in the art theater, watching it for the first time, not having any context for who this guy was, and being blown away by it. Yes, it's a lot of it's could be considered simplistic, pseudo, Pollocky,
Yep.
but it's still gorgeous to look at, including some of the, there's a scene later where a character named Milo, who is a Julian Schnabel stand-in played by Gary Oldman. We see his studio, and I remember my recollection of it is it's a big kind of red room where he's like serving spaghetti.
Yeah.
It's such a colorful thing, but
Yep.
it's like when they did that Mad Max black and chrome version a number of years ago. Is like George Miller always wanted this movie black and white, so here it is. I'm like, no, that movie is so colorful and so powerful, especially the sandstorm scene where it's all those different colors in that horrible storm, that when you see it in black and white, just everything just flattens out to what was described in that essay. The art blends into the fabric of the film, which is exactly what you don't want to do unless the story is so compelling that you want to focus on it. But I think focusing on the way this story is told in this movie is a big mistake, because there's barely a story there. You have to go, I think the triumph of this film, much like Make Me Famous, is that you come out of it wanting to know more about Basquiat, which is to say you want to know anything about Basquiat. Go pick up a biography or a book of paintings where you can learn more about his life. This movie is like, hey, isn't this an interesting guy? I can't really tell because it's all very snippy vignettes. There's a whole bit towards the end where he goes to visit Warhol in his studio, and there's a guy. No, it's not the piss painting one. It's the one I think where they're painting the Amico kind of stallions on the wall. The scene after that is a time jump, but it almost looks like it took place within the same scene, because it's Warhol's assistant coming by and giving a box that he received in the mail of this football helmet with dreadlocks on it. And it turns out that there was a whole interlude there, a time jump again, where Warhol had given an interview talking about Basquiat in a non-favorable way and setting up this kind of rivalry between the two of them. That's dealt with in about a half sentence worth of exposition. And I'm like, no, tell me about this story. If David Bowie is doing such a big job of appearing in this movie as Andy Warhol, I want to know more about that relationship. That could be an entire film.
Right. I agree. I think one of the problems with Basquiat too is they probably, even though it's a story about a man who died in his 20s, they probably try to tell too great a sort of swath of it, because there's other things that I'm shocked that they didn't make more of. And again, maybe it's legal rights, or they worried about being sued and stuff, which is always sort of a hindrance in these kind of things. And there's composite characters and fake named characters here. They don't even put Julian Schnabel in it, and that's clearly who Gary Oldman is playing, which I'm not sure why that is, unless it's taking too many fictional licenses with what actually happened. But Basquiat famously dated Madonna in the 80s, and they lived together for a time. That is nowhere to be found in this. It's like, why aren't you? I mean, that could be its own movie, because I think they were both about like, can I be a provocateur? Can I be a great artist? And can I make money off of it? I mean, I think those three things were kind of the themes of Make Me Famous, as well as this film, and maybe any other film about an artist, be they a painter or a rock star or an actor. Is like, I want to, make a difference. I want somebody to notice it, and I don't want to be a starving artist. Okay, it shows some of that then. But I mean, I think from this movie, it's funny. Maybe Schnabel feels he would have lost sympathy with the audience, but this man became a very famous and very rich artist in a short time, as did a couple of those people. Make more of that. And instead, they always sort of make him like he stinks and he looks bad and he's walking around, like a heroin addict on the street. And I mean, there's those parts of them, but again, that's what we expect from the movies about the artists. They just can't keep. But I mean, he did have a cocaine problem, but I think his cocaine problem was a bigger problem than heroin. I mean,
there's no indication of cocaine.
Exactly, and that's how he lost. He had like a hole in his nose. And those kind of things would make it interesting, or Madonna or other things, or just how about the interviews he gave and when he was profiled and became a celebrity and all that. You don't see or get much sense of that, and yet he actually handled all that quite well. But maybe that doesn't fit in that somehow he's being victimized or not appreciated for his art, and they're trying to make it a racial thing and some of that kind of stuff, which seems a little unfair.
I don't know if it was unfair though, and I want to wrap up on this point because this kind of goes back to Make Me Famous.
Yeah.
In that interview scene with Christopher Walken, he says, "Are you an artist or a black artist?"
Yeah.
And they do make a point in this film and possibly also in Make Me Famous, although I can't recall specifically, about the fact that Jean-Michel Basquiat was one of the first or maybe the only like black artists to come out of that scene or to make it to be as notable as he was. And
Right.
you do kind of wonder, is it because that was such a rare thing or because he's talented and that's rare? And could Edward Brezinski have kind of picked up on that and been like, not to, I hate to say it, but like, oh, he's only famous because, he's black, or Keith Haring's only famous because he does those cartoons, or Warhol's only famous because he does, soup cans and silk screens or stencils. The idea of the gimmick, and Brzezinski just didn't have a gimmick. He was just a painter who worked really hard, but
Right.
because he wasn't able to sell himself, there was a line from that documentary, like, he never found someone to exploit him because no one found anything particularly exploitable about him. But that's a question that's never really resolved in Basquiat either, which could have been a fascinating, what did his contemporaries think of him and his talent? Or do these gallery owners and agents just zero in on the fact that he's a black artist and that's like a big sensational thing?
Right.
There are, particularly in the latter part of Basquiat, a number of interactions he has with people where he brings up race. I think it's after that interview, because maybe that stuck in his craw. When he's in the cab with Benny, played by Benicio del Toro, Benny makes some remark about him, acting like a monkey or something like that. And he's like, how can you call me a monkey? And is that like a black thing or whatever? And he uses, more unflattering language. And then Benny says, "How dare you? Like, why would you? We've been friends for years. Why would you even think that that's what I meant?" And he gets out of the cab.
Yeah. Right.
Where is that story?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of that just is sort of left at a certain amount of surface level, and it's, we leave it with the snide journalist. But yeah, but I think to your point though, and one of the reasons why I really love the documentary so much more than Basquiat is that I got a sense of all of that movement, that time period, what the artists were trying to say, what they could or couldn't say, how important it was to have the right advocacy from the Make Me Famous documentary. Here, a lot of that is still undetermined. I mean, as much as, you could say, well, maybe there was a certain amount of uniqueness in him because of his race and stuff. But, they also gloss over the fact that there was a progression in Basquiat's art. He started out as this graffiti artist called Samo, which meant for like same old stuff. And yet they were making these very clever lines and sort of comments on the world that as graffiti and written statements out and that kind of thing has been around a long time as sort of an art form unto itself forever and a day. But none of that's really explored because, again, it's very little dialogue, very little talked about here. I know that, the idea of film is that film is a visual medium and you should show it, not say it. But sometimes dialogue has to cover that which you're not going to ever be able to get as far as historical context or some of the truer meanings of people. The key is to use the dialogue to make it sound like it's not trying to do that, that it comes up in natural conversation or, part of, I mean, they had it here when they were doing profiles of them in all these magazines. They could have done it there, but that's what I think is fascinating about all of this is that there's so much more to artists and art than just like, oh my God, everybody knew he was talented from the time he was 7. Well, Basquiat was one of those talents who was very, very talented from the time he was 4 and 7 and doing things. And he wrote a comic book and stuff like that at 7. And, he was very,
no idea about any of that.
Yeah, he was a very talented person. So he was not just this like eccentric, crazy person that somehow people discovered. No, he was a talented man for many, many reasons. They had commentary on stuff and everything like that. They could explore more of that, but when you just want to have it be more interesting to have him wake up in a box and look like he's homeless, that's an easy rags to riches, kind of seeming to present it, and that's not really the true story. But again, Schnabel, even being an artist, falls into some of the artist movie cliches.
Well, one thing I got from this conversation is I want to see another documentary about Jean-Michel Basquiat. from the perspective of a Black artist community from that time. Did he have contemporary? Was there a Black Edward Brezinski that was trying to make it, either as a traditional painter or maybe an out there artist in the Warhol vein in that scene? Or was it mostly just a quote unquote white thing? I don't know, but that would have been really interesting to find out. What did Basquiat's racial contemporaries, if I might use that really awkward phrase, think about him and his ascent to fame? Did they think he deserved it, or did they respect him because, as you said, he'd been a lifelong artist who kind of experimented and did things that kind of pushed the form and the genre? I don't know, but someone should make that movie if they haven't already. If they have, out there, folks, let me know what it is, because I'll watch it in a heartbeat.
And certainly Basquiat's work in that time period also set up and started the hip hop movement. And that as well, which I think became its own art form, and maybe not a visual typical representation in the idea of paintings and some of those traditional things, but like the documentary Make Me Famous portrays too, is, this is when video and videos and filmmaking and mixed media were becoming a thing. And it wasn't just painting anymore. It wasn't, it used to be drawing, painting, sculpture, that's it. But, sure enough, illustration, magazine covers, film, of course, photography. I mean, there was a time when photography wasn't appearing in magazines, and it took them a long time before those kinds of things started to make their way into the museums as well. So it all became variances of art. And this one, I think, could have portrayed the artist that was Basquiat beyond just his paintings a little bit more, and those people that he influenced and or rubbed shoulders with: Madonna, the hip hop community, all the celebrities, and the art world that he made a lot of money off of. So it's an incomplete portrait. Yeah.
Well, but this, I think, has been a pretty complete conversation, Jeff, and I appreciate you. I thought, hey, we'll knock this out in an hour, but no, it's been, we've really gone to some places, and I appreciate your insights, your patience, and most of all, your friendship. So thank you, Jeff York of The Establishing Shot, and also Pipeline Artists. Folks out there, if you still love Basquiat, the 1996 film by Julian Schnabel, enough to buy a black and white version of the 4K, which also has a color version of the Blu-ray, but it hasn't been as cleaned up. You can find that at the Criterion, and I'll have a link to that below. And also, as a reminder, tomorrow night, you can go to the Wayfarer Theater in Highland Park, Illinois, and see the director and producer of Make Me Famous after the 6 p.m. show. They'll be doing a Q&A. And again, this is a film that I think you need to see on a big screen, and also multiple times, because it's a fascination, and I think it's a great art education. Make you think about a lot of things. Yeah, so I think we're going to leave that here. Jeff, thank you again. Folks out there, if you like this show, please be sure and like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. We have a Patreon. That information is down below. Support Jeff and all of his reviews and his caricatures. Information on that will be down below. And until next time, whenever that is, whatever that is, thank you very much, and take care. Hey everyone, Ian here. I know, long time no see, but if you like the video you just watched, feel free to subscribe to Kicking the Seat right here, and also check out the playlist and recommended video right here. Thanks for watching.